And Everald mentioned that he and I have known each other for some years. It's actually 29 years, Everald. I will ask Dennis Atkins to come forward and introduce Dr Jim Chalmers. Thank you, and Dennis Atkins, please.
When he first got into Parliament that year after the 2013 election, the Courier Mail asked me to do a couple of pen pictures on politicians who are worth watching. Anyway, I picked Jim Chalmers on the Labor side and James McGrath on the LNP side, and they've both been interesting in their own way. Jim has got a bit further than James, but James is still there batting away, so who knows where he may end up. But Jim has had a remarkable career and he is now Shadow Treasurer. It's a great honour to introduce Jim. He'll do a terrific job, I'm sure, of launching the book. So put your hands together. Here's Jim Chalmers.
Now, some of you will know that earlier this year, the spectacularly successful musical called Hamilton was unleashed by Disney onto hundreds of millions of television screens the world over. And it's really remarkable, I think, to understand that the story of the least famous, least appreciated founder of the United States has now grossed something like $650 million just on Broadway. It's an incredible tale, and it's brought to life by this remarkable guy called Lin-Manuel Miranda. And he makes a hip-hop soundtrack to make the Hamilton musical so unique and so wonderful. And the reason I begin tonight by mentioning Hamilton is so that we can consider this contrast. Here in Australia, even our most recognised and most accomplished founding fathers are still almost unknown, or at least at best only narrowly known. There's no catchy song about Edmund Barton or George Reed or Alfred Deakin. There's no movie or musical about those guys. We just haven't made the same effort to publicly and popularly acknowledge the people who built our federation, and we need to change that. And that's why, Everald, we are really so pleased that you've written this book, Dinner with the Founding Fathers, and so pleased that you've included us in the launch tonight. And in doing so, we honour you for telling the story of Federation and the founders in your characteristically colourful and memorable way. Everald, you're a great friend to all of us here today. You are a source of extraordinary kindness and counsel to all of us. You are a bringer of whiskey and conversation, which are two constant themes of the book itself, for any of you who have already read it, as I've been fortunate to do. You're Australia's most prominent and impactful advocate for older people. You're an author, an historian, a storyteller. This is your second book. You're an infrastructure obsessive, trains and roads and bridges, as many of us know. But I think in many ways, Everald is himself kind of a bridge. Between generations, young and not as young. Between religions, his uniting church and the other faiths of the world. Between parties, political parties, his friends on all sides of the political aisle, and so many of us are here tonight. But I think as well the book is a kind of a bridge. It's a bridge between Federation and more modern times as well. It's actually 4 books in one, if you leaf through the copy that you might have bought on the way in. But in those 4 books, it really focuses on 2 events, on a dinner and a lunch 9 decades apart. And we shouldn't just skate over what we're talking about when we talk about this dinner in the book, and you'll know what I mean when I read it. It's an extraordinary gathering. There has never been so much whiskey consumed in 204 pages before in the history of literature. This dinner is so grand when you read it, and you'll see what I mean, that it actually has a formal half-time arranged in the dinner itself, doesn't it, Everald? And it was such a not-to-be-missed event that Charlie Kingston from South Australia managed to attend even though he had died 2 years earlier. But more seriously, it's a story about how the founders united 6 disparate colonies, spread across an area the size of Europe, and made it the best nation on earth. And there wasn't a major crisis or a defining injustice to unite Australians in revolt or in this cause. But there was resolve and there was vision. And there was compromise as well. there was a determination to ensure that despite the vast distances and differences, that we could find common ground on common goals. And our founders did this in a way that few other nations on earth at the time had managed to do without violence. And there were missed opportunities as well, and the book touches on those. The missed opportunity to bring New Zealand into the fold is one of them. And the book itself captures some really amazing exchanges and some really incredible moments as the founders went about their work. The key speeches that turned the Federation debate, Parkes in Tenterfield but also Deakin in Bendigo. Or the miracle on the Lucinda, when after days of impasse at the 1891 Constitutional Convention, Griffith, Barton and Kingston sailed up the Hawkesbury River, and they had Andrew Inglis Clark's first draft of the Constitution, and they came off the boat 3 days later with a penultimate draft of the Constitution. And only partly were they able to achieve this because Griffith supposedly refused to let anyone get off the boat until the work was complete. But what I value most about the book, and when I think about it, what I value most about my own friendship with Everald, is the way that it urges us to learn from the past as a pointer to the future. Everald, as we all know, is forward-looking, but he understands where we've been. And what I admire about the book is what it says about the early focus during Federation on republicanism, for example. What it says about recognition of the First People. What it says about how the founders misjudged the Senate, something that all of us are capable of from time to time. And how it talks about how for more than a century the state and federal governments of our country have muddled through and made do and sometimes have made it work. Now, reading Everald's book is to be struck by how methodical and how pragmatic the founders were. Federation took 2 conventions and referendums spread across a decade. It took compromise and negotiation. Western Australia would only sign up if a railway was thrown into the deal. There were prominent secessionist attitudes to navigate. Queensland wasn't initially represented at the 1897 convention. In New South Wales, the first referendum in 98 failed. Premier George Reid threatened to withdraw his delegation over the Braddon Clause before a solution was found. The smaller states had grave concerns that the Federation would be dominated by the more populous states. And as Everald really beautifully describes in the book, without the negotiating skills and pragmatism of the founders, and I think Barton in particular, the Australian continent could still be governed by 6 separate fiefdoms, fuelled by what Everald calls an unfathomable range of intense parochial attitudes. So the founders gave us something remarkable but imperfect, and it was left to us, to generations of Australians, to turn that into something better, to reform and rework our federation to adapt to how the nation was changing. So I think we need to go back to seeing if we can make sure that we buttress this federation that the founders built with structures that outlive individual governments and individual parties and deliver something enduring, where those structures can measure progress properly, where those structures can make sure that local government, state government, federal governments are working together, measuring progress and making sure that the resources go where they're most needed. Now, the founders of Everald's book may have gathered in the exclusive rooms of the Melbourne Club and the Australia Club, but they cared deeply about the welfare of the people outside those walls. Outcomes for real people in real communities should still be the touchstone for how we take the Federation forward. If the founders could bring together those 6 colonies with all of those challenges, it shouldn't be beyond us to make it work better into the future as well. Properly recognise the first Australians, Australian head of state, fixed 4-year terms, all of the steps that need to be taken to overcome intergenerational disadvantage in our communities. And to do all of those things, we can be guided by those conversations from the past, the conversations that Everald describes so vividly. The conversations between Barton and Deakin and Griffith and Fisher and Watson at this grand occasion in 1910 and the subsequent follow-up some 90 years later. Everald, it's an absolute cracker of a book. It's a beautiful read. I really enjoyed it during my 2 weeks of enforced quarantine, thanks to our friends over here. It was an incredible read. It's something that you should be really proud of. It's full of colour and character and conversation, just like its author. And I know that I speak on behalf of every single one of us here when we say how proud we are that you've included us in the launch tonight. Thank you.
Everald, I'm wishing you all the very best with your book. I understand this is the second best book you've ever written, because the first one I think was with my father Henry. Anyway, I wish you all the very best on this new book called The Founding Fathers. Anthony.
Oh, and Everald, what a great book. And I know my good mate Jim Chalmers is there tonight, and you reliably have informed me that Jim's great-great-uncle by marriage is George Reid, our fourth Prime Minister. And I refer to page 188 of the book, where George Reid was quite corpulent, actually, and I quote, "The fondest memory of him is infamous, often quoted confrontation with a humorous interjector during an election campaign rally. Noting Reid's substantial gut, the voter called out, 'What are you going to call it, George?' Reid's instant response was, 'If it's a girl, I'll name her Victoria, after our beloved Queen. If it's a boy, I will name it after myself. If, as I suspect, it's all piss of wind, I'll name it after you.'" So I finish on that quote, Everald, and I too wish you every success with the publication.
Look, I, like Jim, really enjoyed this book. It is truly a ripping read. And of course, it does really invite the question, could something as audacious as what occurred in Federation happen in Australia today? And of course, Everald very bluntly and pretty quickly in the beginning of the book refers to federal parliament in recent years as a haven of gross inertia. Now, of course, I exclude any government I served in from that criticism. Everald, it's a real pleasure to introduce you to say a few words about what is a fine book, one that has a lot to teach us about in terms of policy making, but most importantly, a book which is testament to the pragmatic idealism that we need to make our country a better place. Everald, come on down.
A couple of things I just want to say. When I finish my speech, I'm going to get you to sing the national anthem, not because I'm a jingoist like Donald Trump and one is better. I think we should sing the national anthem in gratitude and in honour of the founding fathers who are probably looking at us, and thank them for the great nation they have. And our nation's been a bit tested in the last few months with states and the federal governments fighting one another and what have you, and the federation's been stirred up a bit, and I think we need to recommit ourselves to all the things that the founding fathers did. So I'm going to get you to sing the national anthem. When I was a boy out in the bush, we used to have to sing the national anthem at everything, the start of school, at church, at functions. When you went to the movies, you had to stand up for the national anthem, which was, of course, God Save the King at the time. And so we don't sing it enough. So at the end, I know you'll have a sore backside from sitting down all this time listening to this. We're going to sing the national anthem simply because we love Australia. I want to just chat about a couple of things that in the book that I think we need to take into account. It's, as Wayne and Jim have said, it's written in the form of a novel. All the historical facts are right. And I've read books about all the characters in it, and I've tried to assess their character and say this is the sort of things that they would say. But there are several things in it which is still unfinished business, and I just want to cover them in a short time. There is no preamble to the Constitution of Australia which sets out what sort of a nation we are. Lots of constitution of nations say this is what we stand for. We have nothing in the Australian Constitution about it at all. And we get Australians hopping up and saying, you know, these refugees that come here and start these brawls, they've got to stick to our Australian principles or we send them home. And every time somebody says that, I say to them, well, tell me what these Australian principles are. tell me what they are, and then we can fix them. And I haven't yet found anybody who can tell me what the Australian principles are. They usually say, well, it means you've got to be a good bloke. Well, I mean, that's really something you want to put into the preamble of a constitution anyway. Now, Alfred Deakin, who was a spiritualist, and Bolton Stafford Bird from Tasmania, who was a minister of the Congregational Church, tried to write a preamble. They felt it ought to be there, and they got nowhere, mainly because the Roman Catholics and the Protestants in the room would never agree on anything about the morals of a nation. And back when I was growing up, if you're a Catholic, you're liable to get thumped by a Protestant anywhere, and so they just couldn't agree on what the preamble should be. And it's not there yet, and at the very least, we ought to have a preamble that says that we want, as a nation, to acknowledge that Australia was not founded in 1901 or in 1788. Australia was founded 65,000 years ago and has evolved from that to a nation that has got over 100 nationalities in it now. And we ought to, at the very least, put that in the Constitution so it's acknowledged. And you can't argue about it because it is quite simply the truth of the whole matter. And that's some outstanding business that we've got to handle. No women. Oh, by the way, I forgot to acknowledge the traditional owners. When you get a bit old, you forget things. And I don't want to use all the traditional words you use. I just hope that I can work with them to reach the day when their heritage is listed in the Australian Constitution. Now, there were no women at any of the convention things. Now, that's another one of Everald's slight exaggerations. There were women there. They did the catering. There were no women allowed to take part in any of the conventions. There were no women members of parliament in any of the states. Women were not allowed to vote in the states. And the only state that passed legislation to allow women to vote on the referendum was South Australia, which passed it a couple of years before. And they were the second parliament in the world to give women the vote. The first one was New Zealand a few years earlier than that. It took the Americans 20 years to get round to it, and the British 35 years to get round it. But that happened. Anyway, women had absolutely no role in the whole thing. And finally, the Commonwealth passed in 1903 legislation that gave them the vote on everything. Now, the anomaly of women's role in Australia is still unfinished business for this country. I was in the Parliament in 1973 when Gough Whitlam got legislation passed saying women would have equal pay for equal work. Bitterly opposed by the Conservative opposition who said Australia will go bankrupt if we pay women the same as we pay men. And as soon as they got outside after the legislation was passed, they said, well, look, we agree that women should get equal pay for equal work, except they don't do equal work, and they never will do equal work, and therefore we'll fight that every inch of the way. And there's some misogynists out there still fighting that battle now because women still don't have equal rights in anything, in all the things that they do. And so we still have a long way to go to fix it, and we should have it enshrined in the Constitution, not political legislation on what the rights of women are in this country. Neither were Indigenous Australians given a vote anywhere or taken into consideration. All the Constitution says is that Indigenous Australians shall be looked after by state governments, full stop. That's the only message they got. And had Barton and Deakin insisted that there had to be mention of Indigenous people in the Constitution, the Federation of Australia would not have come about. End of story. It would not have happened. And it took until 1967 for Australia in shame to give Aborigines a vote. We had a referendum for Harold Holt for that to happen. And finally they got the vote. They became persons. They weren't included in the census up till then. They didn't even have birth certificates issued up till then. But we had the hide to ask them to serve in the Australian Armed Forces in 2 wars. And when they came back, they were denied a pension which white guys got because they were not Australian citizens, and that's the eternal shame of this nation. And so finally we've got to get round to fixing this. We thought we'd fix it by throwing money at the problem. You know, you can buy these people, you give them more money, they'll shut up. That's been a paternalistic nonsense which hasn't worked. And so right now we've got to make sure that we do something about it. Now, there are all sorts of other things that I would want to say, but I just want to refer to two quickly. One is the dismissal of Gough Whitlam in 1975, and I've got a section of the book on that. And the Governor-General at that time used reserve powers to sack Whitlam. And those reserve powers, he had the right to use them, but he should not have used them, because they're actually set up because Queen Victoria, who was a silly old bat, she didn't want federation to happen. She wanted the 6 states of Australia to become states in England, like Yorkshire and Lancashire, and we'd send representatives to the Parliament over there. But she was terribly, she wouldn't sign up. Deakin and Barton really confronted her. She was worried that Australia would produce prime ministers who were not British gentlemen, who would not fit the club. She couldn't cope with prime ministers that might say, starve the lizards and stone the crows. You know, she couldn't cope with that. And she put the reserve powers in solely so that she could dismiss a prime minister who was not a British gentleman. And that's how it got there. They gave in to the old girl, and that's what Kerr used to fire Whitlam, which was a disgrace because Whitlam had the confidence of the lower house, and the Senate had no right to deny supply because the Senate can stop a money bill, but the founding fathers did not envisage they'd ever stop supply. And so it was a tragedy all round from those things. And it all happened because of old Queen Victoria. And look, if you're at the Royal Ball and they announced a dance and she was the last woman available that you could dance with, you would retire to the bar. That's how it went. We live with the legacy, you know, right till now. Now, one day we'll become an independent nation. At the moment, we're still tied to the British Crown. All we need to do, we actually don't need to form a republic. Zelman Cowan, a personal friend of mine, advised me one day, he was a great constitutional lawyer, all you need to do is have a referendum where you remove all mention of the British Crown and you replace those words with the people of Australia. And that's all you need to do. And to say the Governor-General will be elected by the people of Australia, will not be chosen by the Queen or by whatever. And we'll get round to that one day, and that's some unfinished business that ought to happen. And I don't say that because I've got any animosity to the Queen at all. I happen to think that she's one of the most distinguished people that have been on the planet in my lifetime. I just don't believe she's got any right to have Governor-General sacked in this country or whatever. We've grown up, we get rid of the apron strings. Now, all throughout the book I've posed issues that I believe is unfinished business. And I'm hoping that this book will tackle a lot of that unfinished business because the time has come 120 years later to do that. And the time has come when we need to take some action. And I hope we can take it on a bipartisan basis, because it'll only work on a bipartisan basis, and we've got to have referendum after referendum. One of them being that we can't have a Senate where senators who got a couple of thousand votes in some state get elected to the Parliament and then they have the right to make a decision. It's the casting vote on things that deal with the lives of 25 million people. It's an absolute nonsense, and it's got to stop. And so all of those changes need to be made. And we can do it on a bipartisan basis. I just want to say, I got a phone call tonight, just show you how you can be bipartisan. I got a phone call from Eric, or text message rather, got a phone call a few days ago from Erica Betts, a right-wing senator in the government, happens to be a very good friend of mine. Eric took pity on me and became a mentor of mine years and years and years ago. And he phoned me a couple of days ago and then sent another text today to say that he believes that the bipartisan way in which he and I have worked, he and I are poles apart politically, but we've kicked a few goals together. The other day he phoned me and said, Everald, we're going to work on this dementia business, mate, because he said, I've worked out the one virtue of dementia is that left-wing guys get it and right-wing guys get it. So how about you and I work to fix this thing, and we will. And so I hope that we might, as we're making all these changes, we'll never forget the words of Abraham Lincoln when he made his famous Gettysburg speech, and we'll all work towards it. You probably know the words better than me, and after I finish this, you're going to stand up and sing the national anthem and you're going to roar the roof off. But let's never forget, in all the changes we made, what Abraham Lincoln said: the government of the people, by the people, for the people, must never vanish from the face of the earth. Stand up and sing the national anthem. Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. With golden soil and wealth for God, our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
I think it was very interesting to see Everald's suggestion that we just change the constitution, that the Australian people elect the Governor-General. So I can see here a campaign that we elect Everald as the first Governor-General. And Tony Windsor describes him in the foreword as Australia's oldest teenager. So I'm sure you've got plenty of years left in you, Everald, and I'll definitely be part of that campaign, and I look forward to the musical, The Founding Fathers. But thank you to all our speakers.